For the rest of this Nearpod, we're going to focus on pretty much the same topic, and that topic is monasticism. Monasticism was very key to this week because thanks to monasticism, like really massive swathes of Europe were converted to Christianity. Or, reconverted in the case of some. Because, of course, as we know from class, by the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, all of Rome was Christian. That was the official religion. But the so-called barbarian or Germanic groups had moved in from parts of the world that had not been the Roman Empire, and so Christianity was not their state religion. So this meant that in the centuries following the end of the Western Roman Empire, there were people who were Christians living alongside people who were pagans. And that there's a lot of migration, since the term age of migrations, as we know, and this meant that the already established Christian church felt it needed to go and convert people to Christianity. And if they were already Christians, well, did them no harm to be reminded, because they could have lost their way in being isolated. So monasticism was one way of them doing that. And monasticism refers to the practice of monasteries, and monks are the individuals who live in monasteries. Now, monks, their original history, they started out as those Christians who rejected the worldliness of society to pursue a life of spirituality focused on God. And this meant that these early monks are often called hermits or anchorites. Those are both terms to describe someone who lives in physical isolation to contemplate spirituality and their love of God instead. So this was actually the ideal of the early Christian church, but the downside for them was it didn't stay solitary for very long. Lots of people wanted this experience, which they believed to be a pure experience, to be closer to God. As a result, best compromise was to form communities of like-minded individuals who all wanted to pursue, and they all shared this goal. So all sorts of men were attracted to a lifestyle of spiritual contemplation. So all sorts of men became monks, from the highest status to the lowliest. A big turning point in monastic history comes with this guy, St. Benedict of Nursia. And as you can see here, St. Benedict of Nursia lived at the end of the 8th century. Sorry, my cat is crushed. St. Benedict of Nursia lived at the end of the 5th century through to the middle of the 6th century. So we are dealing with a period that's, very soon after the end of the Western Roman Empire. So St. Benedict of Nursia founded a monastic house, he founded a monastery, and he wrote a set of rules for the monks who lived under him. And appropriately enough, the name of these is, unusually does what it says on the tin, it's the Rules of St. Benedict. And the rules of St. Benedict were different from what went before, because they were strict, but they weren't really into like the hardcore weird punishment that some very isolated monks thought they had to do to be close to God. So St. Benedict's rules, they downplay extreme fasting, it downplays self-inflicted punishments. It was a hard life, it was a strict life to allow you to focus on the spiritual important things, but it wasn't, a really horrible life. So the monks who lived under St. Benedict's rules, their lives were based on chastity, poverty, and obedience. They lived in single-sex communities with no contact with the opposite sex. They prayed lots, and they also undertook physical labour. Physical labour was mainly farming, because this allowed the monastery to be as self-sufficient as possible, because remember, their goal was to get away from the corrupting influence of the world. Good way to do that is to be as self-sufficient as possible. Benedict, his rules also came about because he was really concerned about the needs of these communities of monks and how to make it harmonious so everybody can focus on the important stuff, the Christian stuff. So he wanted to make sure that order was established. He wanted to have some regulation in how people interacted with one another, and he wanted people to have support to help them in their spiritual growth. So he looked around and he thought, what is the best model for me to base this on? And he believed that it was the family. So the head of the monastery was called the abbot. And so he modeled the abbot after the father, that, the father is there to look after his whole extended family. And that means that all the monks were considered brothers. So you didn't actually need to be a priest to be a monk. To be a priest, you actually have to be ordained, the term is. And to be a monk, a lot of them are ordained, but not all of them are. And this actually was very important in the Middle Ages, because it meant that because you didn't have to be ordained in the church to be in St. Benedict's rule, it meant that it was open to women, because back then, as today, women could not be priests in the Catholic Church because only men could be ordained. So St. Benedict's rules became super popular because they were applicable to both men and women. So these women would band together, only they would be under a mother. And the mother of the abbey was called an abbess, and that's why nuns call one another sisters. So St. Benedict's rule organizes the whole day. I mean, it is a strict life, don't get me wrong. And he had the whole day divided up into regular periods of prayer, both private and communal. They were told exactly when to sleep. They were told when to read. And then they were told when to do manual labor too. Now, the big thing about monks and monasticism in terms of converting people is, well, this became very popular. A lot of people looked at St. Benedict's rules and even, the communities of monks and were like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to devote my life to spiritual contemplation. And so when you get more and more and more and more people joining, an issue's going to be you're going to run out of space. There's not going to be enough beds for everybody who wants to join. So monastic influence could spread because one monastery, if they got too many people, they would go off and sort of form a splinter-related monastery. And so this system is called mother houses and daughter houses. And if we were in class, I'd draw you a picture and a diagram, but it's still really easy to get your head around, because the mother house was the original monastery and the daughter house is the splinter house. So the daughter house would have always had this connection with the mother house. It would have been considered an extension of it. And by this, I mean, it wouldn't have just been, one mother house makes one daughter house. It would have been a mother house makes lots of daughter houses, and some of those daughter houses have daughter houses of their own. It's a relational thing. And so in this way, monastic communities with very similar ideals could end up having connections, networks spread over really, really big parts and big areas. The other thing is that where these monasteries were. Now, the monastic ideal was to get away from the corrupting influence of the world. So the very early monks, the ascetics and the hermits and the anchorites, they tended to go off into the desert and live alone in the desert. Or there's one discussed in your textbook that I know students always manage to spot pretty quickly, since I'm in the stylite, who lived on top of a pillar to physically get away with people. So these monastic communities were the same. They didn't want to be in the middle of a city. They wanted to be far away from the world. But who else do we know is living in rural areas, mountainous areas, low populated areas? But, well, that's where the so-called Germanic groups, so-called barbarian groups live, because they're rural communities. So this means that the villages of these so-called Germanic groups are living side by side with these monks. And so the monks are teaching them their ways and modeling a really good way of life. And so conversion to Christianity happens. So the monks, therefore, played a really, really, really big role in converting the people of Europe to Christianity. There was really only one major difference between being a woman in one of these monastic orders and being a man. And that is, if you're a woman, these houses you lived in, the term for them is cloistered, and that means closed. So, you're a woman. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you don't want to dedicate your life to God and contemplation. But they were cloistered meaning that they were not out in society. They were closed off, walled off from society. I mean, the male monks had as little deliberately to do with the wider world as possible, but the women by design really had even less. And they were led by, as I said, an abbess rather than an abbot. And you might think, God, why would you want to do that? You know, you go into this monastery if you're a woman and like you'd never leave again. Why would that be attractive? Well, you think about what we've learned about society in the early Middle Ages. There's really, if you're a woman, even if you're a man, there's really not very many career options for you. If you're a woman, you're going to be a wife or mother. And so for a certain type of woman, becoming a nun would have been far more attractive than being a wife. Now, we're going to now look at another type of church within the overall Roman Catholic Church, and that's the Irish Church, because Ireland, my home country, had a really important role in spreading Christianity. But if we go back, though, it actually was a very late convert to Christianity. Ireland wasn't converted to Christianity until the 5th century. And that's because Ireland, unlike neighbouring Britain, had never been part of the Roman Empire. Instead, they had to send missionaries to Ireland because it just didn't automatically get converted by being part of the Roman Empire. And so St. Patrick acted as missionary in the 5th century. So the story goes, to the Irish and converted them to Christianity. Now, today, the debate is not so much was Patrick a real person, but is Patrick a composite of many different missionaries sent off to Ireland to convert the people? And the chances are there were several missionaries active at the same time, of which Patrick was one. For example, some historians think that there was a bishop called Palladius who was actually maybe even there first before Patrick got there. St. Patrick, though, is a fascinating figure. Historians like to argue and discuss who he was and what he did. Part of the reason why we're really into him is because he actually wrote things down that have survived. So one of the items that he wrote, and he wrote at the time, remember, is what we call the Confessio. And that is a biography. So he actually, in the Confessio, sounds a bit like confession, it is. He's setting out, this is my life, this is what happened to me. The other source that we've got that he wrote and has survived is called the Epistola, and that is Latin for letter. So in English, we call that Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus. And this was a letter, and it's like, burn letter. He writes this letter to a Roman renegade warrior who kept capturing Patrick's converts and capturing them and making them into slaves. So Patrick was busily converting all these pagans into Christianity, thinking he was doing really well, and then Coroticus was coming in. He was a pirate and stealing all of his converts and selling them off into slavery. And this made him really mad. He was like, okay, stop stealing my converts. So Coroticus was, on the surface, a Christian, obviously a really, really bad Christian. So Patrick wrote a letter to him to condemn and excommunicate him. So it deals with a term we're going to keep hearing again and again over the semester, a major threat in the medieval world, excommunication. To be excommunicated or excluded from receiving communion meant that you were in reality excluded from the church. Because you weren't allowed to receive communion, and that is such an important part of the Mass. So that is like a massive, massive deal back then. Religion was a central part of people's lives, and to be shunned removed their ability to communicate with God. So that was also terrifying to them. So excommunication was therefore a great thing to threaten people with, to get them to toe the line. And we find it's mainly popes and other very senior ecclesiastics excommunicating or threatening to excommunicate kings and important lords on a pretty regular basis. Although ordinary people were scared of it, chances of them being excommunicated very, very, very slim. So the next video clip you're going to watch, it is describing a common conversion procedure that the missionaries used against the so-called barbarian tribes across Europe. Because if you think about it, right, what do we know about their society? It's warlike. What might you do if you were a Christian missionary to really appeal to this warlike society? Also considering that their pagan gods were natural features or impersonal beings who lived in sacred waters or mountains. They also knew that the best thing to do was to convert their king first, because in a lot of these cultures, he had some sort of divine power. So, you know, the king converted, so Christianity's a-okay, you all should convert, then they're all going to convert. But the Christian church in this time period deliberately integrated whatever it could from pagan religions into Christianity because they wanted people to convert. They were going to be pretty flexible. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some things that were always going to be absolute no-nos, but there were bits that they were like, you know what, we can work with this. And there's, I think it's in your textbook, I hope it is anyway, Pope Gregory the Great, who we were talking about in class, he actually wrote letters to missionaries saying, okay, you know, you're going to have to meet these people, not halfway, but somewhere along the way if we want them to convert to Christianity and stay good Christians. So just think about, if it was you, how would you get through to these Germanic so-called groups that we learned about last week? And there's also going to be a link to the Confessio and Epistola, and I want you to think about what type of source this is. Is it a primary source or is it a secondary source?